Hello and welcome everyone to this our first session. So far you should have been able to read through the set text that has been assigned to you this week. You should have been able to read Barth's the portion of Barth's book God in Action, and you should have started to engage with Barth's argument in response to his theological milieu. Barth argues about the task and the nature of theology. And we said that Barth was reacting to his contemporary milieu by saying that his colleagues in theological departments at the time were letting the wind of outside culture come inside theology. Theology has its own domain and its own rules by which it abides. And then we said that God, as Barth defines him, is totaliter aliter, which means completely other, totally other. And God reveals himself. He reveals himself through himself. He reveals himself. So at this point, with this in mind, hopefully, the frame of the problem to our question for this session begins to emerge. How can we know anything about God? Indeed, how can we know truth at all? How can we know truth? Well, as I'm saying here in this slide, let's start with some nomenclature. Nomenclature meaning the specific words that we use in theology. This fundamental question that we are asking today is called the question of epistemology. Epistemology is a word that comes from two Greek words, episteme and logos. Episteme means a certain knowledge or a science, and logos obviously means word or reasoning upon. So the question of epistemology, that is about how we acquire knowledge and truth. So epistemology is the branch of philosophy that is concerned with knowledge, and more specifically with the way we acquire knowledge, obviously, of truth. So today, in our lesson, we start with a philosophical question. How do we acquire knowledge of truth? How can we say that we can get to know truth, that we can get to know? In fact, if God exists, then he must by definition be the greatest and most perfect of all. Now, this is not a controversial definition. Even if you are to debate with someone who is an atheist, someone who doesn't believe in God at all, they would still agree with you that if God were to exist, then God would certainly be the greatest and most perfect of all, by definition. Now, the problem is that most people, even though this is an uncontroversial statement, most people, and especially most Christians, think that this should be understood in terms of magnitude. I'll try to explain this a bit better. God, if it's understood in terms of magnitude, God shares the same being as us. He just does it better. So God is a greater and better expression of other things of which we are familiar, like ourselves. God is like us, it's just a bit better, a bit bigger. He's a greater magician, pretty much. He can do cool tricks, which we can't. Now, why is this not the proper way of thinking about the nature of God? Because I can always think of something greater than the greatest thing that I have just thought of. Now, St. Anselm says, God is id qua nil maius cogitari potest, that thing above which I cannot possibly conceive anything else. So if we understand his greatness in terms of magnitude, then I can always think of something a bit bigger, a bit greater. No, this should not be God's greatness and highest perfection should not be understood in terms of magnitude, sharing our being, but just doing it a bit bigger. It should be understood in ontological terms, another specific philosophical word that we are learning today. Ontology refers to the very being of things. God is being itself. Now, what's the difference between this and understanding God in terms of magnitude? If you understand God in terms of magnitude, then you're saying that there is an amount of being in the world and God shares the majority of it and we take a smaller portion. If we understand God's nature instead in ontological terms, we are saying that God is being itself. Not that he shares in being, but that being itself is God. God is being. Then you cannot think or conceive anything greater because that is the greatest that you can conceive, being itself. You cannot conceive two beings, for example, because that is being itself. But if that is the case, if God is being and does not share being, then in God and only in God, all the attributes coincide with his being. So to say God is and God is good is the same thing. To say God is and God is infinite is the same thing, because being is the nature of God. God is being itself. So to say God is and God is truth is the same thing. God is truth itself. Just like God is being itself, God is truth itself, God is love itself, and so on. All these attributes coincide with the nature of God. As I said, if you understand it this way, then it's a rather uncontroversial statement, even with people who should not believe in God. If God exists, if God were to exist, then clearly this would be the way that we would have to imagine him. Okay, so let's go with that. If God exists, he is being itself, therefore his attributes coincide with his being. Therefore, if God exists, God is truth and truth is. But then the question becomes this: how can I know that truth, which is God himself? How can I say that I can acquire truth? Once again, the question of epistemology. How can we attain that truth when that truth is God? I hope that some of the problems will start to emerge in your mind. There are two main problems that we need to deal with in answering to this question. First of all, we are finite beings. What does that mean? Does it mean that we have been created badly? No, it doesn't mean that. It means that our very nature is, I'm not saying incompatible, but at least it's very difficult to succeed in knowing God, who is infinite by his own nature. You remember, in God, if God is being itself, all his attributes coincide with his being. So to say God is and God is infinite is the same thing. So if God is infinite by his very nature, how can we finite beings grasp him? Understanding, after all, means grasping. Comprehendo in Latin means grasp around. If God is infinite, he escapes our grasp. Second, and probably most important of these two problems, is we are fallen beings. Now, we have used two philosophical specific words so far, epistemology and ontological. Now, fallen is a theological technical word. It refers to original sin, the sin of our first parents, as it is described in the Bible. So original sin in Adam and Eve. So the question is, even if we were capable in our finitude to grasp the infinite, How can we possibly do that now, after original sin, after we as human beings have been affected by the sin of Adam and Eve? So we are not in an ideal condition. We are in a lapsa or fallen condition. So perhaps the person that explained this better was Hugh of St. Victor in the 12th century. He uses a metaphor, a sort of parable, a sort of story to explain the problem behind what we are trying to discuss today. And it's called the metaphor of the three eyes, and you can find that in the Sacramentis Christianae Fidei, first book, 10.2. What he says is, imagine as if humans were created originally with three eyes. Now, one set of eyes was the eye of the flesh. That is our physical eyes. So these eyes were given to us so that we could see reality around us, what we can touch, what we can smell, what we can see, everything that is around in the three-dimensional or four-dimensional reality around us. The second set of eyes, Hugh says, were the eyes of the mind. Now, by that he means a proper reason, rational abilities that worked well. And by that set of eyes, we humans were able to see our inner self, our very identity, our very psychology, and we were able to reason properly. So our reason was right and good at all times. The third set of eyes was the eye of contemplation. Now, Hugh says that eye was the one that we were given to see God. Remember the story in Genesis. Adam speaks with God face to face. God comes down. The story says that God comes down in the Garden of Eden and walks around with Adam. Hugh of St. Victor says that's the eye of contemplation. Adam was able to see God because he was given that set of eye. What happened after the fall? Because of the fall, only the eye of the flesh, Hugh says, continued to function properly. The eye of reason became bleared and made the human effort to ascend to God by reason unreliable. Now, he doesn't say completely wrong, but he says unreliable. To him, in fact, this is the mistake of the pagans. Now, he looks at the way that the ancient Greek and Romans and pagan philosophies and religions used to try to understand something about God. They would look around themselves, they would look at nature, and they would start reasoning about it and come up with an idea of God. And yet, they absolutized that idea as if it was infallible knowledge and made that God. And Hugh says, no, actually, it wasn't that they weren't supposed to look around, but that they thought that their efforts were reliable. That's where the problem was. Do you remember the story in the Bible of St. Paul going to Athens and discovering the altar to the unknown God? And St. Paul says, it's not the fact that you're offering this to an unknown God that is the problem, but the fact that you are not recognizing that that is the God of heaven and earth. So Hugh says the eye of reason is not completely broken, but is unreliable. However, the eye of contemplation in the fall became completely blind, making the vision of God the direct vision of God, the kind of vision of God of Adam walking with God in the Garden of Eden, absolutely impossible to us now. Absolutely impossible. So, eye of the flesh functions properly, eye of reason bleary, eye of contemplation blind. But then what if this is the case? So we have said, as finite beings, we cannot grasp the infinite itself. And even if in our original state, before the fall, we might have been able to see God with the eye of contemplation, now we are no longer capable of doing so. Now, what does that mean? It means that at the very least, the upward movement of our epistemology, that is, remember, our search for knowledge, how we attain knowledge, how we attain knowledge of God and truth. Well, that upward movement is compromised at the very least, if not completely impossible, completely blocked. So, what are our options at this point? Now, one could say, well, in the end, Gorgias, the Greek philosopher, was right. In fact, there is a sort of revival of Gorgias' philosophy recently in our postmodern era, where people start saying, well, there is really no truth, all truth is relative. There's nothing new under the sun, says the Ecclesiastes. These are very, very ancient ideas, 5th and 4th century before Christ. Gorgias used to say, there is no truth, and therefore there is no being itself. And if there was truth and being, you couldn't know it, I couldn't know it. And even if it could be known, we couldn't tell each other. It would be incommunicable. Now, this sounds very postmodern, but if you zoom into what Gorgias is actually saying here, these truths, these statements are all self-invalidating. Why? Because if you say there is no truth, well, that's the truth, isn't it? You are saying that there is no truth, therefore the truth is that there is no truth. That is self-invalidating. You are both affirming a truth and denying it at the same time. Also, if you are affirming that truth, it means that you know it and you are telling me about it. So all this postmodern revival of Gorgias' philosophy is actually quite, if you zoom in a little bit, it's self-invalidating. It's self-invalidating. Truth does exist. Now, we have talked about the bleary eye of reason. Even that bleary eye of reason gets us that far. We have just reasoned out that these statements, oh, there is no truth and we'll never know what the truth is. The bleary eye of reason gets us thus far. We have just reasoned it out and we have just determined that they are self-invalidating. So, truth does exist. But if truth does exist, and therefore by definition, by rational definition, this is all uncontroversial, it is both knowable and communicable, then at some level, and I'm not sure how, but at some level, we must be capable of truth. What does capable mean? Capacity is the ability to grasp, comprehensio, as I was saying before. Comprehendere in Latin means grasp around. So at some level, we must be capable of truth. Probably the best and most profound and most poetic expression of this deep desire and innate capability, this yearning, is in the word of St. Augustine, where in Confessions, in the first book of Confessions, he writes, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." There is this yearning, there is this capability for infinite, the capability for truth, and we are restless until that is the case, until we grasp, until we are yearning towards that truth. So the question of epistemology is fundamental to all of this. How can we get, therefore, to that truth? Now, I'm going to be a bit mean here, and I'm going to leave you with that question. We have examined the problems. We have said that saying there is no truth, we can never understand the truth, is self-invalidating. But we've also talked about the frame limitations of our epistemological quest, our finite nature and our fallen character. So, what do you think is the answer to that question? How can we, therefore, even though we are yearning for that truth, how can we get to truth? What is the answer to the question of epistemology? How can we know truth and how can we know God? I'll see you in class. Bye-bye.